May 1945, the Third Reich collapses and the Red Army stands victorious with the most produced tank of the Second World War, the T-34. Across Europe from Berlin to Prague, over 35,000 of these medium tanks remain in Soviet hands, battle-worn but operational. The war is over, but for the T-34, a new mission is just beginning. A transformation that will see these machines serve on battlefields across 3 continents for the next 4 decades. In early May 1945, as Germany surrendered, the Soviet armored forces possessed the largest tank fleet in history. The T-34 had proven itself from Stalingrad to Berlin, earning respect even from German tank crews who faced it. Unlike German armor that crumbled under the weight of complexity and fuel shortages, the T-34 had been designed for mass production and brutal reliability. Now, with the war in Europe concluded, Stalin's armies turned their attention eastward and to the emerging tensions of the Cold War. By war's end, approximately 57,000 T-34s had been produced across all variants. Unlike the Tigers that the Allies systematically destroyed, the Soviets saw no reason to eliminate their most successful weapon. The T-34-76, which had dominated the middle years of the war, was already being phased into the improved T-34-85 with its more powerful gun and larger turret. But both versions remained in service, and production continued at Soviet factories through 1946. The variety of conditions these tanks displayed reflected their combat history. Some rolled off assembly lines in the war's final months, their paint still fresh. Others bore the scars of Kursk, Bagration, and Berlin, their armor dented by German shells, their tracks worn from thousands of kilometers of operation. Many showed field modifications, improvised armor additions, or battle damage hastily repaired by frontline workshops. Unlike German tanks that required specialized facilities for maintenance, T-34s had been designed to be serviced by conscript mechanics with basic tools. The Soviet Union faced a strategic decision. These tanks represented an enormous investment of industrial capacity and resources. Scrapping them made no sense when potential adversaries loomed on every border. Instead, the Red Army began a comprehensive program of assessment, upgrade, and redistribution that would define Soviet armor policy for decades. As the war ended, the Soviets launched an immediate program to organize and modernize their massive T-34 fleet. The question was not whether to keep them, but how to use them most effectively in a rapidly changing world. The transition from wartime production to peacetime management began almost immediately. The Soviet Union moved systematically. Tank armies that had fought across Eastern Europe were reorganized and partially demobilized, but their equipment remained in service. The Red Army established vast storage depots across the Soviet Union and in occupied territories, at facilities near Moscow, in Ukraine, and across Siberia. Thousands of T-34s were preserved under controlled conditions, their engines protected, their systems maintained. Unlike the Western Allies who saw German armor as artifacts to be studied then destroyed, the Soviets viewed the T-34 as a continuing asset. Upgrade programs began within months of victory. The older T-34-76 models were systematically modified wherever possible. Many received new engines, improved transmissions, or updated vision systems. The T-34-85, already superior with its 85mm gun, became the standard variant, and production actually increased in 1946 before tapering off. Soviet military planners recognized that the T-34's combination of mobility, firepower, and reliability made it ideal for export and military aid. As Stalin consolidated control over Eastern Europe, T-34s became instruments of Soviet influence. Poland received hundreds of tanks to equip its new communist army. Czechoslovakia, which had produced German panzers during the war, now received T-34s and began producing them under license. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary all saw their armies rebuilt around Soviet armor. The distribution was strategic and political. Countries within the Soviet sphere received T-34s as both military aid and insurance of loyalty. Tank divisions equipped with Soviet armor could fight alongside the Red Army, but could not easily turn against it. Soviet technical advisors accompanied every shipment, training local crews and establishing maintenance facilities that kept recipient nations dependent on Moscow for spare parts and expertise. China represented the largest single transfer of T-34s outside Europe. As the Chinese Civil War reached its conclusion in 1949, Stalin supplied Mao's forces with substantial quantities of Soviet armor. These tanks helped consolidate communist control and would later see action in Korea. Chinese factories eventually produced their own versions of the T-34, known as the Type 58, extending the design's influence across Asia. Beyond Europe and China, the T-34's reach expanded dramatically. North Korea received hundreds before the outbreak of war in 1950. Middle Eastern nations, particularly Egypt and Syria, acquired T-34s as the Soviet Union competed with the West for regional influence. African independence movements and newly communist governments from Angola to Ethiopia eventually operated T-34s supplied by Moscow or its allies. The Korean War provided the T-34's first major post-war combat test. North Korean tank brigades spearheaded the invasion of South Korea in June 1950, and T-34-85s proved devastating against the limited armor available to defend the South. For the first weeks of the war, these Soviet tanks seemed unstoppable, overrunning positions and terrorizing infantry who lacked effective anti-tank weapons. The situation changed when American forces arrived with M26 Pershings and newer M46 Patterns. The battles around the Pusan perimeter and later during the UN counter-offensive demonstrated that the T-34, while still formidable, was vulnerable to modern Western tanks and to air power. American tank crews found they could defeat T-34-85s reliably, though Soviet design and armor still demanded respect. The wider tracks and lower ground pressure that had served the T-34 so well in Russian mud proved less advantageous in Korea's terrain. By the war's end in 1953, hundreds of T-34s had been destroyed in Korea. Wrecks littered battlefields from the Yalu River to the 38th parallel. Some were recovered and displayed as trophies. Others were simply abandoned where they fell, slowly rusting in rice paddies and along mountain roads. The Korean experience taught the Soviets that the T-34, though still useful, was becoming obsolete against modern opponents. The Arab-Israeli conflicts provided another testing ground. Egypt and Syria deployed T-34s alongside more modern Soviet armor in the 1956 Suez Crisis and the 1967 Six-Day War. Israeli tank crews, often operating American Shermans and later British Centurions, found the T-34-85 to be a challenging but beatable opponent. The combination of inferior optics, outdated fire control, and less well-trained crews meant that Arab T-34s suffered heavy losses. Captured T-34s entered Israeli service briefly, evaluated, and occasionally used for training. The Israelis found them mechanically sound but inferior to Western designs in crew ergonomics and fire control systems. Photographs from the Six-Day War show fields scattered with destroyed T-34s, their turrets blown off or hulls penetrated. These losses accelerated the replacement of T-34s in frontline Arab service, though they continued in second-line roles for years. African and Asian conflicts of the 1960s and 70s saw continued T-34 use. From Vietnam to Angola, from Yemen to the Congo, these Soviet tanks appeared in proxy wars and independent struggles. Their simplicity made them suitable for armies with limited technical capacity. Their mechanical reliability meant they could operate in harsh environments with minimal support. Cuban forces used T-34s in Angola. Vietnamese forces operated them against American troops, though by then they were clearly obsolete. Competition emerged among Soviet client states for newer equipment. Everyone wanted T-54s or T-55s, which represented the next generation of Soviet tank design. As these modern tanks became available, T-34s were pushed to training roles, garrison duties, or reserve formations. Some countries kept them for decades simply because they had nothing better. Others relegated them to static defensive positions or converted them to artillery tractors. The Soviet Union itself gradually phased T-34s from frontline service through the 1950s and 60s. Tank divisions guarding the western borders received modern equipment first. Units in Central Asia and the Far East kept T-34s longer. By the 1970s, most Soviet T-34s had been moved to storage, converted to training vehicles, or transferred to the reserves. Soviet military schools used T-34s extensively for training. Young conscripts learned basic tank operation on these machines before transitioning to modern equipment. The T-34's forgiving nature and robust construction made it ideal for this purpose. Driving schools operated fleets of well-worn T-34s, their interiors modified for instruction, their exteriors bearing the marks of decades of student use. Target practice represented another fate for countless T-34s. Soviet gunnery ranges used derelict T-34s as targets for tank crews, anti-tank missile operators, and artillery units. The thick armor that had protected these tanks in combat now served to test modern weapons. Hundreds were blown apart on ranges from Germany to Siberia, their destruction providing valuable training and helping Soviet forces calibrate new munitions. By the 1980s, the Soviet military retained very few operational T-34s. Most existed as monuments, their guns pointed eternally towards some symbolic direction, their turrets welded shut, sitting on concrete plinths in town squares from Moscow to Vladivostok. These memorials honored Soviet victory and served as propaganda, reminding citizens of the Great Patriotic War. Every Soviet city seemed to have at least one T-34 memorial, often positioned prominently near government buildings or war cemeteries. Economic factors drove much of the eventual elimination. While the Soviets had no metal shortage like post-war Western Europe, maintaining obsolete equipment made no sense. Through the 1960s and 70s, vast numbers of stored T-34s were systematically scrapped. Facilities across the Soviet Union processed these tanks, removing useful components, draining fluids, and cutting hulls for recycling. The steel went to construction projects and industrial production, contributing to Soviet economic development. Tank graveyards appeared across the Eastern Bloc. At military depots and former training grounds, fields of T-34s sat awaiting disposal. Aerial photographs from the Cold War era show hundreds of tanks arranged in rows, slowly deteriorating. Some were cannibalized for spare parts to keep others running. Others simply rusted, their paint fading, their rubber road wheels cracking, vegetation growing through their tracks. Environmental cleanup eventually forced action at many sites. Abandoned T-34s leaked oil and other fluids, contaminating soil. Local authorities wanted them removed from agricultural land and forests. In some regions, battlefield wrecks from 1945 remained where they fell for decades. East Prussia, now part of Poland and Russia, contained numerous T-34 hulks that were gradually removed through cleanup efforts in the 1970s and 80s. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 revealed the full extent of remaining T-34 stocks. Newly independent nations discovered vast reserves of obsolete equipment. Some countries scrapped their T-34s immediately. Others sold them to collectors or museums. A few kept them running simply because they represented available military hardware, however outdated. By the 1990s, the era of T-34 combat service had largely ended, yet conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and various African civil wars occasionally featured these ancient tanks. Their presence on 1990s battlefields seemed anachronistic, relics from another age fighting modern wars. Most performed poorly against contemporary weapons, their armor insufficient, their guns outdated. But in conflicts where opponents lacked sophisticated anti-tank weapons, a T-34 remained a T-34, still capable of intimidating infantry and providing mobile firepower. While most T-34s were scrapped or abandoned, significant numbers survived through preservation and foreign service. These survivors tell the story of how the Soviet Union's most successful weapon spread across the globe and how the tank's legend persisted long after its combat relevance ended. Museums across the former Soviet Union maintained substantial T-34 collections. The Tank Museum at Kubinka outside Moscow possessed dozens of variants, from early T-34-76 models to late production T-34-85s, with every factory modification documented. Other military museums in St. Petersburg, Kiev, and across former Soviet republics ensured that examples survived for historical study. Poland and Czechoslovakia, having produced T-34s under license, preserved multiple examples. Polish military museums displayed tanks that had served with Polish armies alongside Soviet forces. The tank monument culture that developed in Soviet territories extended to Eastern Europe, where T-34s commemorated liberation from Nazi occupation, even as those nations later sought independence from Soviet domination. Western museums acquired T-34s through various means. British and American institutions obtained examples from captured North Korean and Middle Eastern stocks. The Tank Museum at Bovington added a T-34-85 to complement its German armor collection. American military museums displayed T-34s captured in Korea or obtained from other conflicts, allowing Western audiences to study Soviet engineering firsthand. Private collectors eventually entered the market. The collapse of Eastern Bloc governments made T-34s available for purchase, and enthusiasts acquired running examples. Unlike Tigers, which are priceless and almost impossible to obtain, T-34s remained relatively accessible due to their large production numbers. Several private collectors in Europe and America maintain operational T-34s, running them at military vehicle events and for historical films. Film industry use extended the T-34's visibility. Numerous war movies, from Soviet productions to Hollywood films, featured T-34s, sometimes standing in for German panzers when real German tanks were unavailable. The mechanical reliability that made T-34s successful in combat also made them practical for film work. They could be driven, fired with blank ammunition, and maintained by film crews with basic technical knowledge. Restoration of T-34s became a specialized activity. Unlike Tiger restoration, which requires years of work and enormous expense due to scarcity of parts, T-34 restoration is relatively straightforward. Spare parts exist in quantity, mechanical systems are well documented, and the simple design means that missing components can be fabricated without extensive research. Restoration shops in Eastern Europe specialize in returning battlefield wrecks to running condition. Today, hundreds of complete T-34s exist worldwide. Many remain on memorial plinths across former Soviet territories. Museum collections preserve dozens in running condition and hundreds more as static displays. Private collectors own functional examples. Each represents not just a single tank, but the 57,000 produced and the millions of Soviet soldiers who fought in them. Several T-34s remain in active military service, incredibly. Laos and Yemen reportedly still maintain small numbers of operational T-34-85s, though whether these ancient tanks could actually fight effectively is questionable. Their presence in inventory lists reflects the extreme longevity of Soviet design and the reality that some militaries cannot afford to replace even thoroughly obsolete equipment. Battlefield archaeology continues to uncover T-34 wrecks. Eastern European forests still contain tanks lost in 1944-45. Russian construction projects occasionally excavate T-34s buried in hasty war graves. Each discovery generates interest among historians and collectors, though most finds are too damaged for restoration. These excavations provide insights into combat damage, crew experiences, and the modifications Soviet tankers made in the field. The T-34's accessibility has made it one of the most studied tanks in history. Unlike the Tiger, where research must focus on a handful of survivors, hundreds of T-34s are available for detailed examination. Researchers can compare early and late production models, document factory variations, and understand how the design evolved through continuous production from 1940 to 1958, when Czechoslovakia finally ceased manufacturing. What makes the T-34's post-war story remarkable is not scarcity, but ubiquity. Where the Tiger became legendary partly because so few survived, the T-34's legend rests on its widespread impact. The sheer number produced and distributed means that this Soviet tank influenced military development on every continent. Its mechanical genes appear in tanks from China's Type 59 to various Eastern Bloc designs that borrowed elements of T-34 engineering. Modern military forces study the T-34 not as a combat threat, but as a historical case study in effective design philosophy. The tank demonstrated that reliability, production volume, and ease of maintenance could outweigh sophisticated engineering. Western designers learned lessons from T-34 survivability that influenced post-war development. The sloped armor that seemed revolutionary in 1941 became standard on virtually all subsequent tanks. The story of T-34s after 1945 is ultimately one of transformation from frontline weapon to global instrument of Soviet power to historical artifact. Unlike German armor that was systematically destroyed, the T-34 remained useful for decades. The Soviets recognized that their most successful weapon could serve political and military objectives long after the defeat of Nazi Germany. By the time the Cold War ended, most combat-capable T-34s had been eliminated through natural obsolescence. They simply could not survive on modern battlefields against weapons designed to defeat far more advanced armor. But their presence in museums, on monuments, and in private collections ensures that the T-34's story remains visible. The contrast between systematic Tiger destruction and widespread T-34 preservation reflects not just different approaches to obsolete equipment, but different philosophies about military power and historical memory. Modern efforts to preserve T-34s face different challenges than Tiger preservation. The main issue is not scarcity, but selection. With hundreds available, museums must decide which examples to restore, which variants to preserve, and how to represent the tank's evolution across nearly 2 decades of production. The abundance of T-34s means that some will inevitably be lost to scrapping or neglect, even as others receive careful conservation. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks for watching.